Hello, everyone. My name is Leila Odobasic Novo, and I am an associate professor at the International Birch University, Department of Architecture in Sarajevo. Today, I would like to present part of the research that we have been doing that's called Sound Lifeline Sarajevo Under the Siege, a city reconfigured through sonic experience. This project or this research is part of a larger project which is called Be Air Infinity Radio, and it's a large scale cooperation project that's under the umbrella of Creative Europe and is co funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union. Creative Europe Project Be Air consists of 9 partner organizations from 7 European countries. So we have France, Greece, Finland, Slovenia, Serbia, Croatia, and of course us from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we all have the same aim, and that is to explore how sound stimuli affect our cognitive and emotional development. In other words, what sound represents to people and the world around them, with special focus on vulnerable groups. So each partner has been investigating the topic from their own standpoint and through their own proficiency by either conducting research and or working on artistic production with the goal of contributing to the overall field. At the International Birch University, due to the local context and recent history of conflict, the vulnerable group are the survivors of the siege. Our team has therefore approached the subject through sonic memory as it relates to the experience of the siege of Sarajevo that took place from 1991 until 1995. So, through the testimony of 15 witnesses and survivors, we explore the relationship between sound, space, memory, and war. Within the field of architecture, the relationship between sound and space can be classified as acoustic and or oral in nature. The acoustic architecture is a term used to refer to the physical properties of sound in an architectural space, which can be empirically measured and, of course, interpreted. Whereas the oral architecture encompasses the emotional, behavioral, and sometimes physical response to sounds in a space. And so this research is actually rooted in the oral space of architecture and the role it plays in the context of sonic memory related to war. And so, just a bit of background, the term soundscape was actually first coined by Canadian composer, environmentalist, and writer R. Murray Schafer, referring to the auditory landscape or transient composition of layers of sonic information within an environment. So, oral architecture and soundscape exist regardless of whether or not they're deliberately designed. There's also an inextricable relationship between soundscapes and the built environment, as the accumulation of daily activities constitute the soundscape, while the built environment in which the soundscape is produced amplifies and modulates it. Thus, a soundscape can also be thought of as an expression of a society and an environment and can help add to an understanding of a place which may not otherwise be visually identifiable. So here a soundscape is positioned as an environment of sound or sonic environment with emphasis on the way it is perceived and understood by an individual or by society. So in this regard, space is in the sounds, at least in the manner perhaps not too far removed from Henry Lefebvre's concept of space as function of social production. Therefore, in order to understand any given sonic environment, one has to understand the semiotics of sound functions through the experience of the auditor, who interprets meaning within the environment through actually the act of listening. And so this brings us to listening, witnessing, and testifying. Of course, listening is a central component in this research in 2 separate but conjoined senses. First, and most obviously, it seeks to understand the dynamics of discrete acts of listening in wartime. Second, it relates this listening to the witnesses at its primary methodology, which is later interpreted, recreated, and addressed through 3 specific artistic modalities that are all part of this research. Just to quote Anna Papetti, she states that Witnessing emerges as an ethical moment that calls us to make sense and respond to these stories, their multiple versions and voices, in ways that open up the debate about the voice and abuse of the past and the present. And so, for this research, 15 participants were interviewed about their sonic memories of the siege period. The participants range in age and occupation, and they also lived in different parts of the city during the siege. All the witnesses are well aware of the soundscape of Sarajevo before, during, and after the siege. The interviewers were conducted in a semi formal style in the studio environment at our university, and they were done either in Bosnian or in English. And so, albeit informal, the questions were structured to reflect the multitude of spatial scales and variety of daily experiences or sonic environments during the war. The questions did not explicitly focus on ballistic sounds or sounds of terror, but rather try to understand how the siege affected spatial morphology and the daily routine conducted in it, and furthermore, how that was reflected through the soundscape and what psychological effects it had on the witnesses, both during and after the war. For this very reason, the name of the project is Sound Lifeline. So, according to the anthropologist Mina Das, witnessing or testimony, when listened to sensibly by a conscious and committed listener, is more than a historical narrative. It can also be therapeutic. She claims that the desire to speak from the subject position of the brevered witness can be understood both in terms of publicizing tragedy to avoid its repetition, so the logic of never again, but it also participates in the recuperative process of speaking testimony in the face of unspeakable trauma. And so the interviews that we did have been conducted with incredible generosity, openness, and honesty of the following 15 people that you see on the screen. Deciphering the soundscape of the siege. So the interviews were transcribed and analyzed as a means of understanding the war soundscape and its impact on the witnesses. The analysis relies on the current war theory studies, as well as the relationship between music, sound, and violence. So you can see some of the references listed over here. It's important to note that while most of these studies have been focused on wartime and detention contexts, on the experience of soldiers, with the exception of Velasco and Plufo, who actually interviewed civilian victims of a terrorist attack during a rock concert, this research actually explores the particularities of listening to the experiences of people, i.e. civilians, who were exposed to long-term sonic violence during the siege of Sarajevo. So, through the individual testimonies, there are many collective patterns within the sonic remembrance of the witnesses. Below, or in the next few slides, I'm going to try to summarize the most dominant sounds as testified in the interviews. For more comprehensible study, you can visit the project webpage, where you'll be able to see more of our research. So let's start by defining the sound source and looking at urban morphology and the siege line. So for those of you who don't know, Sarajevo is a valley, is a city geographically located in a valley with the urban formation that grew around the river Miljacka. Since the city grew linearly along the river, the layers of Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and socialist architecture can be identified within the sequence part of the city, each exhibiting specific scale, proportion, and materials that uniquely affect the acoustics of each area. So the major vehicular artery runs parallel to the river. You can see in the next slide. So this is the major vehicular artery running parallel to the river. And here you can see kind of the typography or the geography of the city, which is kind of like a chamber that captures sound. And so during the siege, this main artery became known as the Sniper Alley. As you can see, it was completely exposed to the fires from the surrounding hill. So the siege line, as indicated here, is circumscribing the city, So you can see it's all the way around the hills, and for the most part was located in the surrounding hills, from which the city was under constant attack, with its citizens being heavily exposed to direct military attacks. With the exception of Grbavica, you can see here how the siege line meanders down into the city and touches the river, comes back up. So this total exposure to potentially fatal danger, so danger points and sniper points were all over the city, um, forced the witnesses to become very aware of the different ballistic sounds and their relationship to space, which in turn affected the methods and rhythms of how they moved through the space. And so, this idea of geography as a sound amplifier and the notion of sounds of war. And so, as already mentioned earlier, um, since all the urban noises appeared during the siege, the geography of the valley actually created a sort of an echo chamber with sounds that, under the peaceful circumstances, could not be heard. So, for example, the flow of the river, and now they became the predominant sonic elements. And so, I wanted to also read out this quote by Barry Thoreau, who says, "Sound and noise events have the strength to capture the whole body, for the fundamental fact that sound is first and foremost a physical vibration that affects the whole body. The body reacts to noise as it does with any stressor, an age-old reaction that associates loud noise with potential danger." And that's exactly what happened. You can see here sniper barriers, you can see here sniper view shield, sniper alley. So um, the whole cityscape changed in order for people to adapt to these new sounds, and also they used sounds as a way of surviving, right? And so you can see people's movements started to change, people's way of addressing or people's way of living started to change. So according to witnesses, one could hear footsteps or a conversation that were taking place a few kilometers away once the ballistic attacks quietened down. At the same time, due to infrastructural damage, new infrastructure and means of transport, especially water and wood, had to be improvised. As such, the sounds of trolleys, bikes, and canisters being dragged through the streets became a new daily sound. One of the witnesses described the sound of the broken electricity wire hanging on the broken pole, swinging back and forth, almost producing a musical sound. Furthermore, according to witnesses, there were very few motorized vehicles on the streets and consisted primarily of the heavy UN transporters, which moved slowly through the city. At times, however, a car at a very high speed, avoiding sniper fire, would screech by, transporting the wounded to the hospital. During the military attacks, very harrowing screams and cries of the civilians could also be heard, often accompanied by sounds of hastened, panicked shuffle, stamping on shattered glass. And so, of course, as mentioned before, the new rhythms and sounds of daily life also became a means of using sound as orientation and movement in this new reality. And so J. Martin Doherty speaks about this. He says people who spent sustained period of time in wartime gradually developed the ability to draw an amazing amount of tactical information from the sounds of battle that surrounded them. Through the war, by means of the war, witnesses were transformed into diagnosticians, expert listeners, urban auscultators, assessing the health not of a patient, but of a neighborhood. And so here, on a more intermediate architectural scales, building became hollow as most of the glass was shattered early in the conflict, and the witnesses therefore described this sensation of living in a tent. And so you can see, first of all, this whole new infrastructure that came up in order to avoid snipers and direct, let's say, the direct view to the hills. And so all sorts of different barriers, all sorts of different protection came about, whether they were solid walls, whether they were bags of sand, or whether they were just visual curtains separating the civilians, at least from the views of the snipers up above the hill, or whether they were stacked up containers. So it really depended on what was available in each part of the city. And you can see here just another day at a local pub, two guys enjoying a beer. And here are old cars that are being stacked up. A kid completely dressed in soldier's outfit, dragging canisters of water, taking it back home. The reality changes. People now have to go out and fetch wood, cut down the trees, completely, let's say, adapt to the new infrastructure or the lack thereof. And then within the interior, now we have shattered glass, and what used to be, let's say, a normal apartment is now completely readapted in order to kind of maximize the safety points. And so this idea of living in a tent because there were no glass, all the glass was shattered, where the outdoor and the indoor sounds would intertwine. And so also basements often became shelters, and they took on the role of communal spaces and sometimes even schools. So their internal echo became a new sonic experience of indoor living. Due to the lack of electricity and thus minimized visibility within the interior space, sound became the main sense for orientation in space. The echo of canisters being dragged through common staircases, the number of footsteps to one's apartment, all became important orientation elements in space. The humming of the generators, for those lucky enough to have them, became the background buzzing noise. On the other hand, on the rare occasion electricity was turned back on, all the electrical devices in the house would suddenly come alive, and a general euphoria would take place. And you can see here these community spaces and common gardens. And so life completely changed and adapted to these new circumstances where sound played a crucial role. Okay, so we went from adapting to these new ballistic sounds to using sound as kind of means of orientation and movement. And then I would also like to talk about sounds of resistance or sound as safe place. So Lasco Plafond and Atlante Dolt say that on one hand, sound, music, and silence are used as weapons in organized violence. On the other hand, they constitute symbolic resources, positive tools that contribute to the reconstruction of subjectivities, and thus can serve as tools of survival and resistance. In both cases, sound and musical practices are essential facets of what makes us human. And so, it's also very important to note the role that sound played in the civic resistance. Not just sound, there was actually a huge cultural resistance that occurred as a means of, let's say, fighting back or staying alive. So individuals communally acted to create an alternative soundscape against the one of the war. This took place in different forms, from cycling in order to create enough electricity to watch a movie, to producing and receiving music. Here, the distinct motivation to act, generating personal sounds against the war forced upon the people, became very significant. According to the witnesses, during the war, music and radio played an important role in creating an alternative space, where through the means of a sonic experience, citizens could feel connected to each other, but perhaps even more importantly, connected to the rest of the world. Thus, common spaces like corridors and lobbies, which were the safest as they were on the interior cores away from the windows, became new places of socialization among neighbors, where impromptu music performances would take place. Many concerts and theater plays were also organized in both formal and informal circumstances during the entire length of the conflict. Children continued to take music lessons, and many rock bands formed during the siege. Radio like Radio Zid, Studio 99, and national TV stations became crucial in bringing the news, but also providing cultural content and new music that was on international playlists, one of the few means of keeping in touch with the world. As such, music and radio became key aspects of cultural resistance that took place by the citizens of Sarajevo. So we see here a poster for Radio Zid. We see the famous cellists of Sarajevo. We see two local guys playing together. Of course, the famous Miss Sarajevo contest that was YouTube YouTube made a famous song about this. And then Bruce Dickens performing in Sarajevo in 1994. We have Susan Sontag directing Waiting for Godot. We have Zubin Mehta conducting the symphony orchestra among the ruins of the city hall. And so there's evidence and there's huge amount of plays that took place officially. These are just official statistics, but unofficially, this number is much, much larger. And then I finally wanted to talk about sound of silence. So the most prevalent sonic memory in most of the testimonials is that of silence. Silence which under different circumstances might be synonymous with ease. But in the context of siege, it became the counterpart to the ballistic sounds, an unequal signifier of danger. Thus, although at times bringing emotional relief, silence also signified tension in the psychological anticipation of what is to happen next. Silence in combination with spatial properties of the city's architecture also allowed sounds that were previously marked by pre-siege daily urban noise to be amplified and clarified. So here we have this quote from Efrat Ben-Zev, Ruth Genio, and Jay Winter, where they say, "Silence lies between forgetting and remembering. Silence is always part of the framing of public understandings of war and violence, since these touch on the sacred and on internal themes of loss, mourning, sacrifice, and redemption." And so these are just some images from our shooting of the testimonials. And in the end, this is all part of an ongoing research, but if I could add some concluding remarks, it's really amazing how sound became an agent or a tool that was introduced as something very violent, something very intruding, and then eventually citizens used it or took over it in order to survive and to create new patterns of movement in to orient in space. And then finally, they took complete ownership as a tool of resistance. So there's also this kind of changing role of the sound within the space and in the configuration of spatial morphology, and how sound becomes an agent of in the end, of resistance. And so these are sort of the concluding remarks. I also want to say that many witnesses really thanked us for the process, and it was also really a rewarding process for us. We could not include all the quotes or all the parts of the interviews, but we think that just how this Judith Herman says, the fundamental stages of recovery are establishing safety, reconstructing the trauma story, and restoring the connection between survivors and their community. And so that's exactly what we tried to do as part of the project. So as part of the research, we also produced 3 artistic works that go along with this research, and they were exhibited at the Historical Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina in May of this year. And so they are the documentary film narrating the siege, which sort of tells the story of this sound as changing agency. And then we have 2 electroacoustic with the one electroacoustic composition and one sound composition that really work together. The Symphony of the Siege by Haris Sahacic is recreation of the sounds as stated by the witnesses, but in a safe environment in an interior gallery. And again, it starts with a very large scale elements, just like an architectural project, and narrows down into the personal space of a personal loss. The piece is about 8 minutes long, and it's very intense. And then we have Mirsada Zec's piece, which is called Peace, and it's actually a sound composition that uses sound as a healing tool. So she uses these frequencies that are meant to be healing and decompressing. And so these 3 pieces together, really 3 artistic pieces, work together as a means of listening to the trauma, narrating it, reconstructing it, refacing it, and sort of trying to heal or to live with it. So that was the attempt through the exhibition that accompanied this research. And these are just some of the images from the exhibition. And so I would like to thank you very much for the time that you took to listen to this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is my name, Layla, L-E-J-L-A, dot O-D-O-B-A-S-I-C, my last name, at ibu,